has been in training up to this moment. We think about the events that we, 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 we think about the events of David's life that have led up to this moment. David starts off as a shepherd, and then after a shepherd, he becomes a um, a warrior. After a warrior, he becomes a court member. He's a member of Saul's court. He's a member of Saul's army, and he gets that training. And then, of course, for the last several years that we had read there in First Samuel, for the last several years, he's lived as an outlaw. And all of these events, all of these episodes in his life have led him up to this moment and put him in position. It is God has been training him. God has been leading him to become this leader of this nation. He's going to be the shepherd of the nation. He's going to be the warrior king. He's going to be the man running the court, running the government. So he's seen that. And he's going to be a man who knows how to move rapidly from one thing to another, like an outlaw has to do. The outlaw has to kind of know how to adapt quickly to situations, and we're going to see how David has learned how to adapt quickly to situations. So we look at this book. The main theme, the main theme in this book, really is found in chapter 22. It's David's song, as recorded there in 2 Samuel, and it's also recorded in Psalm 18. It really kind of conveys to us David's attitude. What we find here is that in David's viewpoint, God's attitude towards man creates opportunities for man, and man's attitude towards God creates opportunities for God. If we look at, I'm going to read this actually from the Psalms. This is again Psalms 18, but you'll find this again recorded pretty much complete in the 22nd chapter of 1 Samuel. And this kind of expresses David's attitude toward God and David's recounting, if you will, of his experiences where God has helped him. He says, verse 1, I'm going to read Psalm 18. And I'm probably going to read all of this, so please bear with me. It's kind of a long psalm, but I want you to realize as we read this from David, kind of the attitude that we see in him. And I've got some outline notes here of what we see from David's attitude and contrast that to what we recall of Saul's attitude when Saul was king. He begins, I love thee, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. I call upon the Lord who is worthy to be praised, and I am saved from my enemies. The cords of death encompassed me, and the torrents of ungodliness terrified me. The cords of Sheol surrounded me, and the snares of death confronted me. In my distress, I called upon the Lord. I cried to my God for help. He heard my voice out of his temple, and my cry for help came before his ears. Then the earth shook and quaked, and the foundations of the mountains were trembling and were shaken because he was angry. Smoke went out of his nostrils, and fire from his mouth devoured. Coals were kindled by it. He bowed the heavens also and came down with thick darkness under his feet, and he rode upon a cherub and flew, and he sped with the wings of the wind. And he made darkness his hiding place, his canopy around him. Darkness of waters, thick clouds of the skies. From the brightness before him passed his thick clouds, hailstones and coals of fire. The Lord also thundered in the heavens, and the Most High uttered his voice, hailstones and coals of fire. And he sent out his arrows and scattered them, and lightning flashes in abundance and routed them. Then the channels of water appeared, and the foundations of the world were laid bare at thy rebuke, O Lord, at the blast of the breath of thy nostrils. And so we begin here, and we see him as seeing God as Israel's supreme protector. He sees him God as his supreme protector, and by extension, all of Israel. He sees that God has been a shield for him, a protector for him through all of the trials and tribulations and travails that he suffered. God has been there. God has been there to protect him. God has been there to watch over him. God has been a force for good to deliver him from the many perils that he's been in. Verse 16, he sent from on high, he took me, he drew me out of many waters, he delivered me from my strong enemy and from those who hated me, for they were too mighty for me. They confronted me in the days of my calamity, but the Lord was my stay. He brought me forth also into a broad place. He rescued me because he delighted in me. Again, we see here is God is David's deliverer, and David sees that deliverance. He's grateful for it. And he recognizes that at all times that he's been, his life has been in danger, and his life has been in danger a number of times, and yet every time God has intervened to rescue him. The Lord, verse 20, the Lord has rewarded me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands, he has recompensed me. For I have kept the ways of the Lord, and I have not wickedly departed from my God. For all his ordinances were before me, and I did not put away his statutes from me, and I was also blameless with him, and I kept myself from iniquity. Therefore the Lord has recompensed me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands in his eyes. With the kind thou dost show thyself kind, and with the blameless thou dost show thyself blameless, and with the pure thou dost show thyself pure, and with the crooked thou dost show thyself astute. And for thou dost save the afflicted people, but haughty eyes thou dost abase. For thou dost light my lamp. The Lord my God illuminates my darkness. For by thee I can run upon a troop, and by my God I can leap over a wall. As for God, his way is blameless. The word of the Lord is tried. He is a shield to all who take refuge in him. As for God, for who is God but the Lord? And who is a rock except our God? The God who girds me with strength and who makes my ways blameless, who makes my feet like hens' feet and sets me upon my high places. He trains my hands for battle, though that my arms can bend a bow of bronze. Thou hast given me the shield of thy salvation, and the right hand upholds me, and thy gentleness makes me great, and thou dost enlarge my steps under me, and my feet have not slipped. And so we see here David exalts in God's righteousness, as he says here, you have recognized my righteousness, or at least my efforts to be righteous, is what David is saying. He also recognizes that God is kind. God has been very kind, very merciful toward him, and we see this again in David's behavior. David will consistently defer punishment. If there's punishment that must be accepted, he will accept God's punishment rather than leave it in the hands of man. He goes on from there. I have pursued my enemies and overtook them, and I did not turn back until they were consumed. I shattered them so they were not able to rise. They fell under my feet. For thou hast girded me with strength for battle. Thou hast subdued under me those who rose up against me. Thou hast made my enemies turn their backs to me, and I destroyed those who hated me. They cried for help, but there was none to save, even to the Lord, but he did not answer them. Then I beat them fine as the dust before the wind. I emptied them out as the mire of the streets. Thou hast delivered me from the contentions of the people. Thou hast placed me as head of the nations. A people whom I have not known serve me. As soon as they hear, they obey me. Foreigners submit to me. Foreigners fade away and come trembling out of their fortresses. The Lord lives, and blessed be my rock, and exalted be the God of my salvation, the God who executes vengeance for me and subdues people under me. He delivers me from my enemies. Surely thou dost lift me above those who rise up against me. Thou dost rescue me from the violent man. Therefore I will give thanks to thee among the nations, O Lord, and I will sing praises to thy name. He deserves great deliverance to his king. he gives great deliverance to his king and shows loving kindness to his anointed, to David and his descendants forever. And again, this is sort of the theme you'll see here in David's administration. David here, again, will consistently recognize that God is in command and in control of the nation of Israel. God is the one who's actually ruling, and David is simply his governor, his administrator. That's the way David sees himself, not as king in his own right, king in his own glory, but simply as the administrator of God. This then, David's convictions created then opportunity for God. God, since David is willing to respect God's sovereignty, God gives him the throne, sets him on the throne, and gives him control of a large kingdom, and in fact, and a growing kingdom. This is increasingly larger. You see, David said, here, I've got people who are serving me, people I don't even know who are serving me, nations I don't even know that are coming to serve me. David has acknowledged God's righteousness, therefore God has blessed David with righteousness. David has defended God and appealed to him for mercy, and therefore God has been merciful to him. David consistently sees God as the superior. His will is better, is more pure, more fine than anything else that David can devise. He recognizes that, and so he becomes God's instrument to do what God will, and God in turn uses David to implement his will, to implement his plans. And we will see that carried through here, this kind of that theme carried through this book to some degree. And we'll see, of course, when the times when David swerves off of this idea, kind of breaks away from these ideas. And of course, what follows is typically disastrous. All right, so from there we'll go on in then to 1 Samuel, or into 2 Samuel, go into that first chapter, and we'll read here what happened, what's happening here. It says, now it came about after the death of Saul, when David had returned from the slaughter of the Amalekites, that David remained 2 days in Ziklag. And it happened on the third day that, behold, a man came out of the camp from Saul with his clothes torn and dust on his head, and it came about when he came to David that he fell to the ground and prostrated himself. Then David said to him, from where do you come? And he said to him, I have escaped from the camp of Israel. And David said to him, how did things go? Please tell me. And he said, the people have fled from the battle, and also many of the people have fallen and are dead. And Saul and Jonathan, his son, are dead also. And David said to the young man who told him, how do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead? And the young man told him and said, well, by chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and behold, Saul was leaning on his spear. And behold, the chariots and his horsemen pursued him closely. And when he looked behind him, he saw me and called me, and he said, here am I. And I said, here I am. And he said to me, who are you? And I answered, I am an Amalekite. And he said to me, please stand beside me and kill me, for agony has seized me, because my life still lingers in me. So I stood beside him and killed him, because I knew that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown which was on his head and the bracelet which was on his arm, and I brought them here to my Lord. So here's David learning of this account. Now we have this story here from this young man who claims to be an Amalekite. And right away we noticed, wait a minute, this isn't the same story as we read just before in chapter 31 of 1 Samuel. And a lot of Bible critics seize on this and say, oh, no, wait a minute. Here's a contradiction in the Bible. Here we have two different accounts of the death of Saul. Well, what the young man has said, the fact that the words that are recorded here are true. This is what the man said. But that doesn't mean that what the man said was true. Okay? There are a number of times in the Bible where the Bible accurately records, properly records, that a lie was spoken. We can think of some of those accounts. In the book of Genesis, if you recall, Satan said to Eve, when you eat of the fruit of the tree, you will not surely die. Well, that was a lie. It was accurately recorded. It was correctly recorded, but it was a lie. We think of later on in in the account of the prophet who goes to see the king, and he's told not to go back, go back by the way he came, and so forth. And he leaves, and another prophet of God meets him and says, "No, because an angel just appeared and told me to bring you back and feed you a dinner." But it says, "But he lied." Okay, so it accurately recorded the fact that here was a lie that was told. And so here is yet again, I believe, another case where the Bible accurately records what is in effect a lie. This Amalekite is more likely he is a mercenary who's been traveling with the Philistines, and he finds himself on Mount Gilboa. He comes across the body of Saul. He's able to remove Saul's crown and his armlet. He would have had some kind of identification as being king, and probably takes them to David, knowing that Saul has been in pursuit of David for some time. So he takes them to David, thinking, "Oh, David's going to be happy to see this. David's going to be pleased at this outcome, and David's going to reward me richly for bringing him news of Saul's death and bringing him the crown and the amulet." Okay? We may consider for a moment the irony of the fact that here is an Amalekite who is taking Saul's crown off of his head, and yet it was an Amalekite that caused Saul to lose his crown in the first place when he refused to slay Agag. If you recall that a few chapters earlier in 1 Samuel, he had refused to put to death Agag, the king of the Amalekites, and because of that, that the kingdom was torn from him. That's what Samuel told him, and so here we have Saul, who, ironically, that crown is removed from his head by this Amalekite. We also might consider the fact that obviously this young man is, here he is. You can imagine he comes into this camp expecting this big hoorah and a celebration. Hey, the enemy of David is dead. He doesn't know that David has just spent the last several days pursuing the Amalekites who come raiding in from the south and took his wives, and his family's captive, and so he's. And so this fellow obviously is ignorant of all this. This would have been a roughly, we pointed out, a 2-day march from Mount Gilboa down to Ziklag. And so this guy has spent 2 days getting down here, probably dreaming of the reward he's going to get. And no, that's not what he gets. Because, we find out what happens next. David, then, verse 11, David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and so did all the men who were with him. And they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the people of the Lord and the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. And David said to the young man who told him, "Where are you from?" And he answered, "I am the son of an alien, an Amalekite." Then David said to him, "How was it you were not afraid to stretch out your hand and destroy the Lord's anointed?" So David called one of the young men and said, "Go, cut him down." And so he struck him, and he died. And David said to him, "Your blood is on your own head, for your mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed." Some of the commentators, well, I'll back up for a moment. First of all, David asked this man, "Where are you from?" Trying to ascertain where is he really from? Does he live within Israel? Is he familiar with what's going on in Israel or not? And it is apparently from his answer, that he is familiar with what's going on in Israel. And so David finds it impossible that somebody who lives within Israel doesn't know that he has not been seeking Saul's life. Indeed, he has defended Saul. He has protected Saul 2 times and has refused to put him to death. And so here comes this fellow bragging about it. And David, I think, is fairly astounded by this attitude. Some of the commentators suggest that David is putting him to death because he lied. When he talks about here in, for example, here in verse 6, he says, "By chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and behold, Saul was leaning on his spear. And some of the commentators suggested that idea of leaning on his spear was that he was trying to impale himself on his spear, that he was trying to commit suicide by impaling himself on that spear. And so that this was the intent. And so David recognizes that no, this is Saul's not going to try and impale himself on the spear. This man's lying. And some people think that David recognized that. Others, I think it's far more likely that David believed him. At least initially, I think David believed him, believed that this story is true. And here, you've testified by your own mouth. You killed Saul. You put the king to death. And who gave you the right? Basically, it's who gave you the right to put the king to death? Who gave you the right to kill the Lord's anointed? And so Saul puts him to death for that reason, or David rather puts him to death for that reason, for killing Saul. And so this Amalekite, instead of getting a reward, he ends up only getting being taken to his own execution. The rest of this chapter then is a song of lament. David now, this is a song of genuine mourning. This is a song of genuine sorrow, and it has been incorporated. A lot of these phrases, you're going to recognize a lot of the phrases on here, because we've incorporated a lot of them even into our own funeral orations, if you will. Some of these terms and phrases are used even in our own time to remember people who have passed on. And we start here in verse 17. Then David chanted with this lament over Saul and Jonathan his son. And he told them to teach the sons of Judah the song of the bow. Behold, it is written in the book of Jasher. This book of Jasher, by the way, has been apparently, we've lost it to history. We don't have a copy of the book of Jasher. So again, the commentators suggest, though, that it may have been the source text for this account here we have in 2 Samuel, that it would have been drawn from that historical record. But David goes on and says, your beauty, O Israel, is slain on your high places. How have the mighty fallen? Tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not in the streets of Ascalon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised exult. O mountains of Gilboa, let not dew or rain be on you, nor fields or offerings, for there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul not anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back, and the sword of Saul did not return empty. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and pleasant in their life, and in their death they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. O daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How have the mighty fallen in the midst of battle? Jonathan is slain on your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan, for you have been very pleasant to me. Your love was to me more wonderful than the love of women. How have the mighty fallen, and their weapons of war perished? And this is that funeral song. And we perhaps recognize some of these phrases. This idea of this phrase, how have the mighty fallen? This has been used countless times at the funerals of great men. David is clearly stunned by the news that Saul and Jonathan are dead. And this becomes the refrain, the key refrain of this lament. How can we lose these mighty men? How can we see these strong and virile men, these men who were great leaders in Israel? How can they be gone? And sometimes, we think of our own situations. We see people who pass from this scene, and we think, well, there'll never be another person like brother so and so, or like sister so and so, and we think about all of those saints who have gone on before, and we think, yes, how can we continue on in the face of such loss? That's kind of what David is is lamenting here. He says, tell it not in Gath. Don't repeat this in Gath. Well, Gath, of course, was one of the leading cities of the Philistines. And of course, this news would have been a cause for celebration there. And as he points out, don't let the Philistines rejoice over this. Don't let them know. They of course obviously already knew that Saul was dead, but don't let them know any more about that. This phrase becomes something of a proverb in Israel. We find it repeated over in Micah. If we go over to the book of Micah, the first chapter in verse 10, actually I'm going to back up to verse 8. It says, because of this I must lament and wail. I must go barefoot and naked. I must make a lament like the jackals and a mourning like the ostriches. For her wound is incurable, for it has come to Judah. It has reached the gates of my people, even to Jerusalem. Tell it not in Gath, weep not at all. At Beth El Ephra, roll yourself in the dust. And this is, again, it becomes tell it not in Gath. This became a proverb, if you will, a proverb or a parable, a proverb certainly of mourning and of defeat. And no, we don't want our enemies to know of our defeat. He curses Mount Gilboa here in this text. He says, let not dew or rain be on you, nor fields of offerings, for there the shield of the mighty was defiled. And so this mountain, this landmark then will become a symbol of Israel's defeat. And in fact, even today, this mountain is covered with sort of scrub vegetation, and nothing more than that. It never has become any kind of a useful place, even in modern Israel. David then goes on to praise the fighting valor of Jonathan and David, Saul and David, rather. You know, of course, he was not there at the battle, but he has fought alongside these men. He knows how they fight. He knows how they would have fought. And so I can understand that in his mind, he can imagine them fighting to the very end, and understanding that no, these men did not go down in defeat easily. They would have fought to the very end. They would have fought with all their strength, with all their might, and they would, as he says here, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back. Jonathan's bow would have been active, and the sword of Saul did not return empty. It would have been put to use, and to good use. And so we understand that he's lamenting these men that have fallen and remembering the times that they have fought in battle. He also gives admonition to the women of Israel. Remember the good things that Saul has done for you. He's clothed you. He's put you in fine clothing. He's given you golden, jewelry to put on your clothing, to adorn yourselves. There's been prosperity under Saul. There had been prosperity. There had been good times. There had been victory, and through that victory, they had enjoyed something of the good life. And you see here is David now focusing not on the bad things that Saul had done. It would have been easy for David to focus on the bad, the negative, the wicked things that Saul had done. But no, instead, David focuses on the good. He's entirely prepared to discuss the good things that Saul had done rather than the bad things. This is, by the way, a picture of Mount Gilboa as it exists in modern times. And you can see, even in this relatively recent picture, it's a fairly nondescript hill. Again, mostly covered with short grass and scrub vegetation, and not much good for anything. It just sort of sits there, kind of in a lump in that particular area of Palestine. David especially grieves for his friend Jonathan. He begins this section again with this refrain, if you will. in verse 25, how have the mighty fallen in the midst of battle? I believe that is a particularly sorrowful phrase from David as he thinks about his friend, Jonathan. He says here in verse 26, I'm distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You have been very pleasant to me. Your love to me was more wonderful than the love of women. And sadly, some in the homosexual community have seized on this passage, and they somehow suggest that, oh, look, David and Jonathan had some sort of a homosexual relationship, some kind of a physical relationship. No, the scripture does not support that. The scripture here speaks of a love that is a deep friendship, okay? That is the language, that's the wording that is used here, is a deep and abiding friendship. If we think about everything that Jonathan has done for David, Jonathan has defended David before his own father. Jonathan has aided David throughout his entire time as being a warrior, as being in the court of Saul. Even when he was escaping from Saul, Jonathan was there, and Jonathan was there to help. Jonathan even came to David saying, I'm willing to serve you as one of your servants when you become king. He was ready. Here he is, the crown prince of Israel, and Jonathan was ready to lay that aside and serve David as king, knowing that David had been chosen by God. David had been the anointed, had been selected as the anointed, and Jonathan had more love for God than Saul did. We know that Jonathan had more love for God than Saul did because Jonathan was willing to accept that and Saul was not. And so these two men are bound not by some sexual perversion that I think is simply a projection of those who have that sexual perversion, and they want to try and project it onto David and twist his words to mean something they don't. But no, here were two men who were bound together by virtue of their fighting together, the battles that they had participated in. They were bound together by their mutual interest in the well-being of Israel, and they were especially bound together by their respect for God. Here were two men who both of them had a deep and abiding respect for God, and who found in one another sort of kindred spirits that way. And to suggest that somehow this could be morphed into some kind of, again, homosexual relationship, the text simply will not support such a position, and does not support such a position. David goes on, of course, to wrap this up and says in verse 27, how the mighty have fallen and the weapons of war have perished. He may here have been referring to that whole army of Israel, because that whole army now, the basic essentially the core of the army of Israel has been defeated, has been routed or slain on Gilboa. And this is a tragedy not just for Saul and Jonathan. Of course, it's a tragedy for them, but it's a tragedy for all of Israel, because now essentially the entire central part of the country lays open to the Philistines. The Philistines now control everything roughly from the River Jordan all the way to the Mediterranean, and from roughly that area of what is going to become Jerusalem, just south of Jerusalem, all the way north, nearly up to the Sea of Galilee. The Philistines are in control of that entire section of the country. And the nation of Israel is teetering on the brink of extinction. And David understands that. David realizes that and sees what a tragedy this is for Israel. Comments or anything on chapter 1? All right, let's go on into chapter 2 then. We'll see these events. Now, it came about afterwards, verse 2, or chapter 2, verse 1. Then they came about afterwards that David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go up to one of the cities of Judah? And the Lord said to him, go up. So David said, where shall I go? And he said, to Hebron. Now, David, of course, is in Ziklag. Ziklag is really a city of the Philistines. God says, no, we're going to get you we're going to get you away from the Philistines. We're going to get you back into Israel. And so he leaves. He has him leave. He leaves. We think about, too, he's coming with a pretty good sized army. We consider those numbers of men, it's one of those what if kind of scenarios. Here's David with all of his army, and they're moving from Ziklag to Hebron. And here is, if you think about that, David had his 600 men who were fighting with him. But in addition, we read from the book of Chronicles where others had been joining him, other from the tribe of Benjamin, from other tribes had been joining with him, so that he's now in command of a pretty good sized army. And if you think about, if that army had been brought to bear against the Philistines, that whole situation of them invading and conquering the central part of Israel might not have ever happened. But, you can speculate endlessly on what might have been. But he consults with God. He finally consults with God, and God tells him, you're going to leave Ziklag, which is, of course, now among the Philistines, and he's going to move to Hebron. He's there. It is there. I'm going to read on. Well, I read this, verse 4. Then the men of Judah came, I'm going to keep going. So David went up from there with his two wives also, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal, the Carmelite. And David brought up his men who were with him, each with his own household, and they lived in the cities of Hebron. Now these men of Judah came there and anointed David king over the house of Judah. David is going to be here in Hebron. He's going to be here. We'll read later on. He'll be here for 3 years. Over 3 years, he's going to live here as king of Judah. Why Hebron? Well, Hebron has a lot of advantages. First of all, it is fairly central to essentially what remains of Israel. This area around Hebron, it's a fairly fertile area. It's got a good food supply, and so it becomes a good base of operations. The city of Hebron itself is up in the mountains, and it's therefore fairly easy to defend. The Philistines, known for their chariots and their use of chariots, aren't going to be out in the rain. And so if they're going to have to come, they have to come on foot. And if they come on foot, now the Israelites have the advantage. This city has also been a city of refuge. Hebron has been a city of refuge since the days of Joshua. And so therefore it is something of a political center as well. Especially over the tribe of Judah, it's a political center. And so David can administer what he has of the kingdom from here. And as you see here, of course, he becomes king over Judah here. It's apparent that David is still the vassal of the Philistines. He's still paying them tribute. He's still recognizing them as ruler. And so he's going to have to live for a while as under their control. They, upon hearing him be named king of Judah, are they unhappy about that? Well, no, they're not going to be unhappy about that. They're going to be quite pleased because, here's David calling himself king of Judah. This is obviously in conflict with the king of Israel. And so now they see here is another weapon that they can use against Israel and put the entire region under their control. And that is the Philistine goal here. We see then in verse 5, and they told David, saying it was the men of Jabesh Gilead who buried Saul. And David sent messengers to the men of Jabesh Gilead and said to them, may you be blessed of the Lord, because you have shown this kindness to Saul your Lord, and have buried him. And may now the Lord show loving kindness and truth to you, and I will show this goodness to you, because you have done this thing. Now therefore let your hands be strong and valiant, for Saul your Lord is dead, and also the house of Judah has anointed me king over them. he sends this message to the men of Jabesh Gilead, and it probably serves several purposes. You know, it's a friendly message. It's first, several things he might have done. First of all, if people are afraid, oh look, David's king, and he's going to take vengeance on anyone who is supporting Saul. He's going to put, execute perhaps, or at least come down hard on anyone who is a supporter of Saul. Well, no, David points out to these men, no, I'm grateful for what you did. You did a good thing for Saul. You recognized him as your king. I'm grateful for that, and you've done a fine thing, and I'm thankful that you did it. And so that sends a very clear message to those who were supporting Saul that David's not going to come after you. David's not going to cause you any hardship. David here is trying to keep things going after the death of Saul. It also confirms to these northern tribes that, yes, David is confirming, I'm not happy about the death of Saul. I didn't want him dead, and I'm sad that he has been killed. He and his sons. I'm sad that they have been killed. And so he establishes that. I never wanted to see Saul dead. It establishes that. And finally, he offers this sort of hand of friendship to this city here in Jabesh Gilead, which is in northern Israel. Now he offers them a hand of friendship, and obviously they are we know they are the tribe of Benjamin. And so here is Saul's own tribe, and David is offering his respects and his friendship to these folks, and again trying to send that message that I'm not coming after you, basically. David also establishes his credentials as king. He points out, I've been anointed king of Judah down here in Hebron, and in a subtle way, he may be reminding all of these people, they're in the northern part of the kingdom, reminding all of them, by the way, I was anointed by Samuel to be king. I've been made king in Judah, but I've been anointed. And it's a subtle reminder to them as he's starting to consolidate his own rule. All right, I tell you what, I'm going to stop there. It's 20 after. I'm going to stop there, and we'll continue on with 2 Samuel 2 next week and go from there. But appreciate your attention this morning.